Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing A Trick of the Tail by the band Genesis.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
We're coming in hot today with another Genesis review, probably one of the best prog bands ever. So many people love them and for a good reason, and while I did have my stripes with them in the past, I do believe that today I can really appreciate and like their music for what it is. And now we are reviewing this album of theirs called A Trick of the Tail, but before that let's get into some of my favorite bits from this album. So today's episode is a special one indeed, and not only because of the album we are reviewing, but because of another thing, and that is its numeral instance, or whatever you might call it. Today's episode is episode 265 of the series, and for you keen-eyed viewers, you'd know that that means that we only have 100 days left for the finale of 365 Days of Prog. And let me tell you something, in the past I can recall several instances in which I was counting down the last 100 days of something, and what I've learned from those instances, well, 100 days can most of the times go by in a hastening flee. It just goes by so fast. So I hope everyone that watches this episode and this series as a whole, you are enjoying what I do on this corner on YouTube, and hopefully we can last this one up until the end. Now, alongside the 100 days we have until the finale, I'll share with you yet another secret which holds just a very coincidental nature to it, and that's the fact that in 100 days, the last episode of the series will be reviewing The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis, meaning that in a gap of 100 episodes we're gonna review 2 of Genesis's albums. And I'll share with you yet another secret, and that one you should not tell anyone, but despite there being 100 days more until I reach that final episode, I actually already gave a listen to The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, so in the course of this video I might hint towards it in several ways, and know that I basically know what I'm talking about because I already know that album, and as well the reason that I already listened to it is because I am preparing in advance. It's the final episode, it's a very special episode, and it needs special preparation to be done on it leagues in advance. Nevertheless, let's now move on to talking about this phenomenal album by Genesis, considered by many to be their last masterpiece, and that's of course A Trick of the Tail. But firstly, let's talk about the backstory for the creation of this album, which is genuinely really cool. Now, I know that it has a lot to do with the lamb and the way that it was made and what happened in its making, and I'm not gonna touch a lot about that because I'll do so in the final episode, but the main point is that after recording and touring The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, vocalist and frontman for the band Peter Gabriel would eventually depart the band and leave them in some sort of a ruckus before creating this album. You see, Peter Gabriel is a phenomenal musician and of course a phenomenal vocalist, and the fact that he departed the band proved to be a major issue because his vocals, the way he sings, his tones, his energies, his melodies, his emotions, whatever, they're irreplaceable. And the thing is, Genesis were left without a suitable option to actually recreate the sound that he gave to the band. The only possible other option that they had was really to use Phil Collins, who contributed vocal parts on some of the prior songs by Genesis, but he was never really the frontman when it came to doing vocals. And having Phil Collins on the vocals actually proved to be very difficult on two fronts. The first one is the simplest one, the fact that he couldn't really recreate what Peter Gabriel brought to the band. The energies, the tones, the characters, whatever, that was not Phil's thing. But the second and main problem had to be with the fact that he was first and foremost the drummer for Genesis. And let me tell you, a drummer and a vocalist usually doesn't really go well together. Just playing a simple drum and singing something else with the vocals creates this sort of clash between the rhythm and the melody, which is really hard to coincide in one place. And when you go even a bit more advanced and complex in one of those regards, it's really hard to do the both. So in order for Phil Collins to be the frontman when it came to the vocals of the band would mean that they'd have to sacrifice something, whether it be him as a drummer or the overall complexity of the music. So the band understood the limits of their capabilities and realized that they had to find a new vocalist. So they published in the papers an ad, of course trying to stay very low key, so they did so anonymously, in which they stated that they were looking for a singer for a Genesis type band. And through that posting in the papers, Melody Maker magazine reporter called Chris Welch actually uncovered the fact that Peter Gabriel actually departed the band, which was a very well kept secret by that point, and he of course revealed it with the next magazine of Melody Maker basically proclaiming on the front page that Genesis was dead. And looking at it in hindsight, Welch wasn't that wrong. Maybe he was wrong about the next album that they would produce called A Trick of a Tale, which happened to be an absolute banger, but from that point onwards, Genesis would lure on and reinvent themselves in a way that wasn't really favorable with a lot of prog listeners and made them a lot more accessible and much more contemporary. But nevertheless, no matter how you look at it, Genesis didn't die when Peter Gabriel left. But that's a whole different story for a whole different day, and let's move back to the A-plot. What happened with the vocalist who took vocal duties for Genesis from now on? Well, the band started running out of time to create this new album, so they had to do something, so they were like, you know what Phil, just go up and try and do the vocal parts on the track called Squawk and we'll see how we move on from there. So Phil did the vocal parts and everybody was happy about it. It sounded good and they wanted him to stay. So the thing that was ultimately decided was that Phil would be the new vocalist and essentially the new frontman for Genesis, and he would carry on this new album. But of course we are dealt with the second issue. How can Phil be both the vocalist and the drummer? And well, in the studio it doesn't really face as a problem. He can just record his drumming parts in one section and then do the vocals, and you know, they can stitch them up in the studio just fine. But when it came to the live touring, this proved to be a problem, so Genesis realized that they had to hire an external drummer, and they didn't pull back on their choice because they brought no other drummer than of course Bill Bruford, which was an amazing pick, and he went with them on tour, and I'm sure that he did a fine job at replacing Phil on the drums in the same type of dexterity and overall complexity that the songs required. But there's one more final thing that I want to touch on, and that's the fact that, well, why was A Trick of the Tale even created in the first place? Seeing as Peter Gabriel, which was basically the front man, the glue that binded the entire band together, left, why didn't the band just disperse and go their own separate ways? Well, I think there's two answers to it. The real one actually is that the band was in a lot of debt, and to regain that debt and actually pay it off, they had to create a new album and have a successful tour, and that's exactly what they did, and fortunately it did work out for them. But the second reason is, well, a lot of records from back then state that the band were just really good friends and essentially they wanted to create music together. They didn't want Genesis to stop, so they did so, and fortunately, in a fate of luck, it worked out for them in the end. But rest assured, Peter leaving the band didn't mean that their relations were over. Actually, Gabriel even popped by the studio while they were recording A Trick of the Tail, and he really enjoyed seeing what they were creating, stating that he knew that they were gonna do fine without him. The only thing that he did state though was that, well, he was kinda surprised by the sheer quickness and hastiness that they were able to create some really great material. But yeah, I think that we have it all. I think that's most of the backstory. If anyone has some more interesting tidbits about this album, its creation, or whatever, you can leave them down in the comments. But now let's get into my personal opinion of this album. What did I think of it? And a lot of you might know that me and Genesis have a very interesting relationship. It takes me around about like 2, maybe 3 years to actually like a Genesis album. So going into this one, I really didn't bring my hopes up because I didn't know if it was the right thing to do. But alas, when I got into this album, I was pretty much surprised to see that this music managed to almost capture a one-to-one representation of the earlier Genesis sound, what everyone knows and loves from Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, Selling England by the Pound. It was basically recreated on here, and even Phil's vocals, who doesn't naturally sound like Peter Gabriel, he's managed to find the right tone and the energies and even some sort of the theatricism to actually capture the same vibe that was on the earlier Genesis albums. Now this album opens up with Dance on a Volcano, which is a very grand track, a very cool opening, very upbeat and very fun, and very much a track that I was likely to listen to in the past. I just don't remember when, but there was a lot of things from it that I kind of recognized, so I probably heard it sometime somewhere. And of course, then after this great track, we transition into something a lot calmer in the form of the next song called Entangled. And this basically sets the mood and the structure for the rest of this album, when it basically goes up to one very pompous track and then goes down to something calm and back up and down and up and down and vice versa. Now Entangled is my personal favorite track from this album. Everything from the guitar that is played lovely by Steve Hackett on here to the harmonies by Phil Collins and the generous accompaniment of the Tony Banks whatever the fuck that is keyboard that he plays at the end, which sounds absolutely amazing, and also Mike Rutherford, who plays the bass on here very subtly but does the right part for the song. And from that point onwards, the album just keeps out pumping really good tracks. They're really nice, and objectively I can appreciate all of them. As I said, subjectively I might not be the biggest fan of all of them. I think like 80% of this album was stuff that I really liked. The rest was kind of a hit or miss type of situation, but overall, knowing and loving the earlier Genesis albums really helped me in actually loving this one as well. Overall, this album, the music on it just put a smile on my face, understanding that this band was basically destined to fail, yet they succeeded and they created one of the great masterpieces of prog in the latter half of the 70s when prog was starting to dwindle. And I just love that end bit where the final moment of the album has that supper's ready quote of "there's an angel standing in the sun," which is just, you know, it's heartwarming. I have nothing to say about it. I wasn't expecting it, but it just shows how authentic and original this album is and how well it fits into the Genesis discography. And this album, it's just a great album, honestly. I might not be the biggest fan of it, but I appreciate every single aspect of it, and it shows that Phil Collins leading Genesis wasn't that bad of a thing. And now in hindsight, after Genesis has finally concluded as a band as a whole, we can definitely say that both runs of Gabriel and Collins have proved to be very successful and very well received, containing within them some of the best music ever written in prog and overall in general pop music. And this album right here is the tide turner. This is where everything was decided. This is where Genesis became something that not only old farts from the past remember, but people even nowadays appreciate the same way with the same amount of love. So this album also hinders to the past with the idea of telling short and concise stories, and especially this album with its 8 tracks basically goes out to tell 8 different separate stories, and they're all represented by one or a duo of characters on this album cover. Now you might realize that this album cover has like 5 or 6 people, I can't quite remember, but there's actually another side for this cover which features the entire ensemble. Now I'll admit I'm not that well versed with the stories and narratives of this album. I really just wanted to get into this one and listen to it for its music and not for the meaning behind it, and I'm perfectly fine with that. But when it comes down to this cover, I love the authentic feel by it. I really like how it just feels like your regular Genesis. It doesn't feel very off-putting and unrelated like the cover for The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, but instead it's just what we expect from this band. Now, seeing as Genesis basically came back to their basics on here, I was pretty sure that they hired yet again Paul Whitehead, who made the most well-known covers for Foxtrot, Nursery Crime, Singing and By the Pound, and he also made the cover on here, but I was pleasantly surprised to discover that this was in fact a Hypnosis cover. And realizing that Hypnosis were used for the first time by this band in particular to create the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway cover, it just is amazing to see how well they can diverse their way of creating covers to create something which is tailored for the music specifically. With the last one being very photographic and kind of surrealistic, this one is just a lovely hand-drawn cover that really signifies everything that's great with the Genesis sound and the Genesis feel. I give this one a rating of 8 out of 10, and in the Genesis chapter in my book, this is considered to be quite a lot. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to From Mars to Sirius by Gojira. Hopefully it will be good. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wallum, Rist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.